Hello, and welcome to this short presentation of my personal views on 3D printing. At the outset, I have to stress I'm not an expert. I do have a 3D printer. I've had it for about a year now, and I've done a number of things with it. I want to share with you the process I went through before purchasing the printer and the thoughts I have around the use of that printer, what works well and what doesn't work well. I hopefully just impart some little information on the topic. 3D printing is a growing phenomenon. We've seen quite a lot of it recently. Certainly you'll find 3D printers around you. If you go to an exhibition, for instance, you'll see them in use. You'll see kits being sold, being manufactured that way, and you hear of lots of people producing things and getting them printed and using them on their model railways. It's not a new technology, it's been around for a while. As with most things, the costs are now falling, and it's becoming much more practical for us to consider having them as a tool that we can use at home. Along with those falling costs, we're also seeing improving functionality. The picture here, for instance, is of the 3D printer that I personally have, or rather, I have a share of. It was a joint purchase between myself and Roger Noble, with whom I'm building a layout, and we purchased it to build items for that layout. The cost of this particular printer was about £350. So what printing technologies are there around? There are a number, and they vary in the way that they print things and what they print, i.e. what the finished product looks like. They can print with different materials, and there are different costs involved. And the prints you get as a result have different qualities to them. So for example, you can print with plastics, you can print metal, you can print all sorts. So the technologies involved. There's something called stereolithography, and what this is it's liquid resin that's cured by using UV light. This is a fairly professional process, and you wouldn't find this in home printers particularly. Quite an involved process, but can produce very good results. This is a sort of process that you might use if you went to one of the big bureaus, such as Shapeways, for instance. DLP is a more recent light-sensitive resin printing process that is becoming available for home printers. It uses LCDs to mask a light source. Where the light gets through, the resin gets cured. FDM, or fused deposition modeling, is the one that probably most familiar with. If you've seen a machine demonstrated at an exhibition, it is probably an FDM machine. It uses some kind of thermoplastic which is fused together in layers, and we'll see much more of this process later. The printer I have uses this process. SLS is selective laser sintering. It's very similar to SLA, but instead of using a liquid resin, it uses a powder that's kept in a vat, and it uses a low temperature sintering process to combine the powders together to form a solid. Again, it's very much a professional printing technology, not something you would find in a home printer. Similarly, there's SLM, which is very similar to the sintering SLA process, but instead of using sintering at low temperature, it actually melts the powder, and you tend to use lasers to do that. You can do the same thing with electron beams, and again, this is a very professional way of doing it, not something you'll see in a home printer. But the process is very similar to SLM, it's just an electron beam rather than a laser that's doing the melting. And then there's LOM, which you don't see very much of, but is very much a professional process again. And effectively, it works in the same way as you may have seen printer ribbons work in the past, where you have a roll of material that goes underneath a printing head, and that head pushes down on that material and basically deposits some part of that material from the carrier onto the thing that it's printing. So very similar to the sort of printer ribbons you might have seen in typewriters in the 80s or 90s. So what can we use 3D printers to do within modelling? Well, the answer is pretty much open to your imagination. You can certainly do non-scenic items, and some of the low-end printers are very good at this sort of thing. So for example here we have a circuit board container that I've printed, so that actually will sandwich a circuit board and allow me to screw it to a layout. So it's a case. You can make up building components if you're scratch building or making your own models. Here I've got a doorway and I've got a window, but it could be a chimney pot, it could be some decorative moulding for the building that you're working on, whatever. Really, your imagination can come up with. You can create your own kits. So here's a kit for a building. This is a fairly simple one, but you can do other things as well if you like. But it's perfectly feasible to do this sort of thing. You do have to think about the finish when you're looking at these sorts of scenic items, and we will talk more about that later. You can also do rolling stock components. So here are a few things I've printed. These are actually 009, so there's a couple of wagon underframes. I have to stress that the wheels that are shown here are not 3D printed. They're a standard wheel set that have been put into the 3D printed underframe. And there's I think it's a 2-plank wagon body there as well that was also printed. And you can print complete models. Here we've got something very simple, a packing case, but you can do much bigger things. Again, it depends on the quality of your printer and the size of the print you can produce, and we will be talking about that in a moment. So where can you get 3D prints from? Well, there are lots of cottage industries where you can buy ready printed components or whole kits. You see many of these for sale these days at model railway exhibitions, or you would if we were having them. Obviously under the current COVID restrictions we're not. You could go to a print bureau. So this is the likes of Shapeways, which is probably the most famous, but there are a number around you can go to, and you can either get designs that are already registered with them printed, or you can get your own design printed. Another interesting approach is something called a maker group. These are becoming quite popular. You would find them in quite a number of large towns around the UK now, and it's effectively a group of like-minded people get together, and between them they will maybe buy a 3D printer, a laser cutter or other equipment and they'll make things. Worth looking around on the internet, as it may give you an easy entry into doing 3D printing or laser cutting, whatever it is you want to do. Or you can take the plunge and you can buy your own printer for at home, either on your own or with a group of friends or colleagues from a model railway club, whatever, and you can then have your own printer to use or share. So when it comes to home printers, what can you buy? There are two technologies that are popular for home printing. You get the FDM, which is the fused deposition printers, like the one I have, or DLP. These are really the only two that are available within the sort of price range and that are easy to use at home that we consider at the moment. This may change in the future. It's like everything, an evolving technology, and things move forward at quite a pace. FDM printers have been around in the home environment the longest of any. These work in much the same way as they have done for some time now. They usually have a reel of filament, sometimes two, which is made of plastic. This is fed to the nozzle and heated. This heating causes it to melt, and then it is laid down in layers by the nozzle onto your model. In this case you can see in the video on the right that the print bed is moving backwards and forwards and the nozzle is moving from side to side and up and down. This forms the outline of the model and it's built up in these layers. As the molten filament cools, it fuses to the layer below. This tends to give an effect a little like you see in sedimentary rocks such as slate, where you can look at the edge of the material and see how the layers have been built up. You can remove this effect by finishing the model by using wet and dry sandpaper on it usually. Prices of these printers have been falling over time and the quality improving, and they are now vastly better than they were when they were first introduced to the market many years ago. The other sort of printer that's popular now for home use is the DLP printer. These have only more recently become available at the sort of price that makes them affordable to your average modeler. They work by having light-sensitive resin, usually sensitive to UV light, which is held in a container at the base of the printer. Underneath this, there is a light source and an LCD screen. The LCD can filter out the light from reaching the resin. Where no light gets through, the resin doesn't cure. Where the light does get through, the resin cures. The object is then drawn up from the resin, layer at a time, on a build plate. This has been vastly speeded up in the video that you saw on the right hand side. When it comes to choosing which printer is right for you, there are a number of things you have to consider. DLP printers have light sensitive resin. You have to think about this. Where are you going to print? Are you going to be able to be away from light sources? You also need to chemically wash the prints when they come out of the printer. This is usually done with IPA or some form of alcohol type material. You need to think about what you're going to do this in, what you're going to do with the waste afterwards. You can't just throw this stuff down the drain. The prints must be cured in UV light to finally harden them, so just printing them on their own is not enough. You must then expose them to the UV for some time afterwards in order to make them hard. You can do this with sunlight, but it takes a long time and is very dependent on weather conditions. The resin is also relatively expensive. From £25 to £30 for 500 grams of the liquid resin isn't unreasonable or unheard of. They are much more capable of a higher resolution, however, than an FDM printer. You can certainly produce much more fine detail on one of these sorts of printers than you can using the sort of printer I have, the FDM. The FDM, on the other hand, has minimal environment issues. One thing you do have to consider is temperature. They are not good at working in cold temperatures or with drafts. It tends to produce poor print quality. It does produce a layered effect in the models that you print, and you have to think about this, whether you want to then do processing afterwards to remove this layering effect, or whether for the application you have it doesn't really matter. For example, if it's something that's not going to be seen on the layout, you may be perfectly happy with the layered effect. The filament is relatively cheap. You can buy a kilogram reel for £20 to £25 depending where you get it from and the quality. There are also different filaments available which have different properties. The common one that's used is a substance called PLA, which is a biodegradable plastic made from cornstarch, which has reasonable properties. It sticks well together. It's relatively resistant to temperature. It's not going to give problems certainly at normal operating temperatures, but you wouldn't want to heat it up. You can also get ABS. You can get PVB, which is a relatively new one on the market, which is more translucent and can be finished off by using IPA on it. This will actually cause the layering effect to disappear. There are others available such as flexible materials as well, so if you wanted to produce model tyres or something made of a rubbery material, you could certainly do that with an FDM printer. There are limitations on what you can print, and a lot of this is down to the mechanics of the printer, and that's discussed in more detail in another video that's on the site. But certainly you're not going to be printing very fine detail, very small objects with an FDM printer. When you're thinking of buying a 3D printer, what are some of the things to think about? Well, really, what are you going to use it for? What are you going to print? And this matters because you need to think about the print finish. If you're going to get an FDM printer, you have to think that the output you get will have these strata in them. If it's scenic things you want to print, you will probably have to do some post-processing with them. Now, depending on the filament you use, the way you do that will be different. For example, PLA can be sanded with wet and dry sandpaper to produce a flat finish. PVB can be smoothed by applying IPA to it. Some other filaments will react differently to different finishing approaches. Print size. Now this matters because you print onto a bed if you're using an FDM type printer, and the size of that bed and the height at which you can pull up the print nozzle will limit the size that you can print. The printer I have, for example, is a Prusa Mini, so it's their smaller printer, and that will print things up to a size of about 18 cubic centimeters, so 18 by 18 by 18, which is fine for relatively small components, for small vehicles, whatever. If you're thinking of 3D printing a 70-foot coach in 4mm, it won't fit. If you're looking at 7mm, you probably want a bigger printer, and they do bigger printers. Mine is a particularly small one. Similarly with the DLP ones, the size of the tank and the LCD screen determines how big an item you can print. These tend to be quite small for the more affordable printers, but it's something you have to look at. Cost. It's not just cost of buying the printer, you also want to think about the cost of running the printer. There's no point having a very good quality printer sitting there that you don't use because you can't afford to put the filament in it or the resin or whatever it is you need for that printer, or it becomes expensive to print very small components, for instance. So you need to look at costs, and not just costs of those components, also think about finishing costs as well, if you need to be buying lots of IPA, for instance. Also think about convenience. As I said, with the DLP printers, you might need to be printing in an environment where there's no light or very little light. You will need to probably wash it in IPA afterwards, so these are smelly chemicals and perhaps not something that you would be welcome using in a kitchen or household environment. So think about that sort of thing. Also, temperature is important. FDM printers don't like very cold temperatures, so you couldn't, for instance, use it in an unheated shed in the winter because it will just refuse to print, and you'll get very poor print qualities as well. Now, having got your printer, where do you go about getting designs? Well, there are websites where you can download things, particularly free websites such as Thingiverse. I've printed a number of things from Thingiverse, including those 009 working components that I showed earlier. Also some components that are nothing to do with the model railway at all. There are also some paid download sites. I must admit I've not really spent much time investigating these, but they do exist. Of course, most excitingly, and probably why you've gone down this route at all, is you want to design your own items to print, and we'll talk about that in a second. So how do you go about creating your own designs? Typically you would use some kind of 3D computer-aided drawing package. This can be free, you don't have to pay a lot of money for these things, and you can get a range of these things from very simple drawing packages such as Google SketchUp to really complex professional CAD systems. The illustration here on the right is of the CAD system I use called Fusion 360. This is a very full-featured professional system, but it's free for non-commercial use. There are a few limitations in the free version. For example, you cannot store lots of designs in their cloud. You have to store them on your local disk, but that's no hardship really. Very good package, and if you look at some of the other videos on the site, you'll see a few examples of me creating some things with Fusion, and in fact this illustration is one of those things that features in one of the videos. The other approach you can use is 3D scanning. Some of you may have seen Alan Butler either at a Model Railway exhibition or one of the earlier Missenden weekends, where he's been 3D scanning people and objects to print on his resin printers that he uses. Very high quality, very interesting technique, but possibly not something that everyone wants to invest in, a 3D scanner. You may find people who will be willing to 3D scan things for you, or you may even be able to hire 3D scanners in the not too distant future. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this has been of some use to you. I do stress these are all my own opinions, and I would recommend you look for other sources of information. Thank you very much.